My name is Julio Capó, and I'm an assistant professor in the history department here at UMass, and today is my great honor to introduce this year's writer-in-residence, Professor Amy Wilentz. Let me first tell you a little bit about this excellent program that has brought so many great writers and thinkers like Amy Wilentz our way since 2006. The history department at the University of Massachusetts Amherst is dedicated to the idea that an understanding of the past is essential to a free and enlightened citizenry. As a measure of that commitment, the Department of History's Writer-in-Residence program facilitates sustained conversation with widely read authors whose historical work engages broad public audiences. Each year, with major funding from the Five Colleges, Inc., we bring a writer of national prominence to campus for a week-long residency in order to give focused attention in our graduate training and beyond to writing for a range of audiences and in a variety of venues well beyond the monograph or scholarly article. Our guest visit courses and seminars meets with students and faculty over coffee, lunches, and dinners, and delivers a public lecture. So tonight we are in for a real treat. The residency is embedded with our signature seminar, Writing History. In this way, graduate students from UMass Amherst expand their ability to write for a wider array of readers, sharing the insight of our discipline both beyond the academy, within the academy, and well beyond. Like so many of us present here today, I have followed Amy Wilentz's career for some time. Wilentz has written extensively for public audiences. Her works have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Mother Jones, the Village Voice, the London Review of Books, and many, many others. She is also a longtime contributing editor at The Nation. In addition, as if that wasn't already quite a bit enough, right? Wilentz teaches in the literary journalism program at the University of California at Irvine. This has allowed her to share her knowledge and approach to historical thought and memory to new generations of writers and thinkers, like many in the audience here today. I have often assigned her work in my classes. Let me briefly give you a sense of her broad range of interests and ability to ground contemporary events in complex historical processes. This semester, students in my Caribbean history course read a thought-provoking piece she published in 2012 in the New York Times that explored the zombie in Haiti. She traced the modern zombie cultural phenomenon as rooted in the historical legacy of colonialism, slavery, and imperialism. She also, however, suggests how the zombie serves as a metaphor more broadly for the disenfranchised and the exploited. Perhaps the Foxconn worker in China, a maquilladora seamstress in Guatemala, a citizen of North Korea, or those living in extreme poverty and subject to hyper-surveillance and discriminatory politics. They are all zombies. As the venues of her publications suggest, Wilentz's elegant and honest prose has extended way beyond the reach of the academy. Her works have thus been commended and honored with countless prestigious awards and accolades in the academic profession, but also popular literary circles. To name just a few, Wilentz has received the Whiting Writers Award, the Penn Martha Albrand Nonfiction Award, and the American Academy of Arts and Letters Rosenthal Award. Just last year, she won the National Book Critics Circle Award for her most recent thought-provoking book, Farewell, Fred Voodoo, A Letter from Haiti. Her talk here today comes from that work, an honest portrait of the tragedies manifest in Haiti following the devastating 2010 earthquake. Her other books include The Rainy Season, Haiti Since Duvalier. This too was the product of her vast experience and time spent in Haiti as a participant observer. In it, she chronicles the fall of Jean-Claude Baby Doc Duvalier and the Tonton Macoute, anticipating the rise and, of course, the fall of rebel priest President Aristide. Throughout it all, she has a keen eye that captures the everyday lives of everyday people, from the secret police to the voodoo priests and priestesses, government officials, laborers, and those in the informal economy. A nod to her most recent work, she recovers the voices of all those Fred Voodoos in Haiti, and how they are both misunderstood by the public and misrepresented by outside sources. Her work, of course, helps amend that. Her other books include Martyrs Crossing, a poignant story set in the turbulence of Israel and the West Bank, and I Feel Earthquakes Move More Often Than They Happen, a colorful portrait of California and its unlikely governor, bodybuilder turned actor turned politician, Arnold Schwarzenegger. In all her well-received and popular works, Amy Wilentz's engaging prose draws the reader in with her truth and transparency. She does not hold back. With every printed word, she epitomizes the very essence of the public historian who forces us to look back in time to better understand our present. So please join me in welcoming this year's Writer-in-Residence, Professor Amy Wilentz.
Thanks, Julio. I always say, beware the introduction. Usually they steal all your best material, and then you're like, what am I going to do now? Julio did that because he has a sense of what I like best about my work. So I thought I'd start with just a little bit of impressionistic background on Haiti, and then describe my engagement there, and the problems of relief, reconstruction, and the charitable impulse. I wanted to look at the misty contrails of the reconstruction effort 5 years after the quake. So let's start with history. I like to talk about the citadel. It's called Citadelle La Ferrière. It's in the north of Haiti. It was built under the rule of King Henri Christophe. Henri Christophe was a king of northern Haiti, but he was also a general in the Haitian Revolution, which began in 1791 and ended in 1804 with the declaration of an independent Haiti. The citadel was built with the help of English engineers, but it was built with Haitian labor. The stones that were used for the building of the citadel were taken in large measure from the French plantations of Cape Haitian, which had been destroyed by the slaves in the Haitian Revolution. Hundreds died during the construction of this quite glorious hilltop, really mountaintop fortress. Today, if you go to the Citadel, which you can do, stacks of cannonballs from those days are still piled in pyramids, and they have the royal crests of the various nations who hated France and were very happy about the revolution. And so you see the British crown on many of these cannonballs, and they're waiting to be hurled at the enemy. Henri was king of the north of Haiti. Pétion was the president of the south of Haiti. And there was a lot of infighting during that time. And eventually, Henri committed suicide, the king of northern Haiti, and he was interred in the Citadel. It was finished in 1824, 4 years after his death. And the generations, the descendants of those who built it, still live in its shadow. The people who are living there around the Citadel, who, if you go and you want to take a tour of the Citadel, those people are the descendants of the people who built the Citadel. People don't move that much in Haiti, except in recent years. So what were they defending with this incredible fortress? Freedom, the right to have small holding. Each family have a small holding instead of working on the giant plantation. Their own right to exploit Haiti, especially the higher-ups like King Henri Christophe, rather than to allow the white man to exploit it. So, interestingly, the overwhelming majority of the slaves who led the revolution were born in Africa. French policy was to run the plantations as a slave camp. It was more a work camp. It was more efficient that way. So you would work people to death and buy new ones off the boat, rather than keep the old people on a kind of retainer even though they couldn't work, and feed the children so that they would eventually, over time, become useful working slaves. It was thought to be more efficient just to stop feeding people and not really deal with the children and just buy new people pretty cheap off the boat who were ready to be slaves. But it was a disastrous policy for the French. So at the time of the revolution, the ratio of black to white in Haiti was 10-1. Just for your information and comparison, in the United States, at the time of the Civil War, the ratio of black to white was about 2-10. So it was a very different situation. It was a powerful force. And in the months leading up to the outbreak of the Haitian Revolution, in the region near the Citadel, where the Citadel would be, slaves went into the forest during their times off to have what the French slave owners believed were dances. But these were actually forbidden Vodou ceremonies during which revolutionary plans were hatched. The French thought that the slaves were using these dances to blow off steam. Indeed, they were. Anyway, back to the Citadel. So it's a symbol of Haitian sovereignty and of the first Black Republic on this earth. And And it's used by the Haitians all the time. You can, there's an insurance company called Citadel Assurance. There used to be an airline called Citadel Air. There was a disco called Disco Citadel. You can find it on bills, printed money. You can find it on postage stamps, of course on tourist posters. But what really is this Citadel? I think it's Henri's useless, wasteful, paranoid extravaganza. The French weren't coming back. They'd been defeated. No one wanted anything further to do with the world's first Black Republic. There were boycotts, that's a little anachronistic word, but there were boycotts, blockades, and debt. It took 100 years before the white man finally did come back to conquer. And when he did, it was not from the northern coast, where the Citadel's cannons were aimed, but the Bay of Port-au-Prince. And the conquerors were not French this time. Guess who? They were the United States Marines. This was 1915. So Haitians know a lot about the white man. They cast off his yoke in 1804 after living under slavery for a century and more. They cast off his yoke again in 1934 after 19 years of the racist U.S. Marine occupation. They paid reparations and debt to France after independence through 1948, when it was finally paid off. This was debt owed to France for property destroyed or stolen in the Revolution. Now, part of this property, interestingly, was themselves. So they paid for burning down all the plantations, they paid for all the crops that were destroyed, and then they paid for their own bodies, because that was also the property of the French. These reparations were, as so often in Haiti's history, many unique instances. This was a unique example of the victor, the winner, paying to the vanquished after war's end. It usually works the other way. The defeated pay the reparations, but not in this case. Of course, this caused radical impoverishment of the baby nation's economy, and I think we see the lasting effects until this day. Speaking of white men, Haiti has also, another reason Haitians are so familiar with the white man, is that Haiti has also been subjected to the attentions of USAID, the American Agency for International Development, for more than half a century, with questionable results. When talking about his philanthropic work for his father, the investor philanthropist Warren Buffett, Peter Buffett explained what it was like to sit on certain philanthropic boards. Quote, "All in the room are searching with their right hand for answers to problems they have created with their left," unquote. That's USAID searching in Haiti for solutions to problems the United States has caused there. So how I came to Haiti. I like to think it was fate, and by now, of course, having spent almost 3 decades involved in thinking about this country, I do think it was destiny. So I was working at Time magazine, and excuse me, any students, graduate students, longtime sufferers of Amy Wilentz this week since yesterday, if I repeat myself. But so I was working at Time magazine. I'd been there literally 4 months, and it was in rooms lit like this, on the 25th floor of the Time Life building, on the Avenue of the Americas in Midtown Manhattan. And it was kind of, it was fun, it was exciting, it was good to be there, but it was a sterile kind of journalism that was practiced there at the time. And at that same time, I read Graham Greene's novel, The Comedians, which is this most amazing piece of fiction that the great journalist and detective writer and entertainment writer and serious novel writer and Catholic writer, Graham Greene, wrote after his quite short visit to Haiti under the reign of Papa Doc François Duvalier, the dictator. And Greene depicts this world of palm trees and dark nights and attacks and assassinations, and the health minister killed at the bottom of an empty pool in front of the hotel grounds, and gingerbread houses, and secret police wearing dark fedoras and sunglasses, and it was just unbelievable. I mean, the exoticism, the second time I read the book after having been in Haiti, I thought, this is a racist work. And then the third time I read it, I thought, no, it's great. So now I'm back to thinking it's great. But at that time, working in this sterile environment and reading this book, I thought, I want to be there now. I need to be there now. I spoke French, luckily, although I realized that wasn't enough. I had to learn Creole. My neighborhood on the Upper West Side of Manhattan was filled with Haitian refugees and their newspapers. They published newspapers like crazy. They still do in Haiti. And so I was reading their newspapers, and the New York Times had a hint of it. But it was obvious that baby Doc Duvalier, the son of François Duvalier, was going to fall, that his government was going to be ousted. And I was very excited. These Duvaliers had run the country for almost 30 years. They had this horrible secret police, the Tonton Macoute, and democracy was going to come to Haiti. We were all excited, Papa Doc, Baby Doc, the Tonton Macoute, an end of this. But I thought, damn, I better get down there, because I wanted to see the evil before it was dispersed. I wanted to see the Tonton Macoute. So I got my Creole tapes, I learned a little Creole, and then I proceeded to insert myself into history. That's how I think of it now. I didn't think of it that way in those grandiose terms at the time, but I got to be there when the regime actually did fall. So I was there for 3 days beforehand. I got to see the Tonton Macoute. Yes, I took pictures of them too. I took a lot of pictures of them and then discovered that my camera did not have any film in it. That is why I'm not a photographer. But my luck was to be there before the international press corps came down, and then they came down. And then I got to follow much more experienced journalists around to see how you cover the death of a regime. And we all went out to the airport because they found out from the State Department when Duvalier was leaving. We all went out to the airport and waited for him to actually leave. And I actually saw him drive his car with his wife and his children and his mother-in-law in the car up into a U.S. Cargo plane and leave the country for Paris. And then the Haitian people came out. At 5 in the morning, they got up out of their beds. They all heard the airplane, because this was Haiti in the old days. A plane left at the wrong time. They knew who was on it. They all came out of their houses, and they took branches from the trees, and they came down into the central plaza of town. And they were all crying. We were all crying. And as I've said to some of you out there, the French hardened war photographers were all crying. I'm going to cry now. So I was hooked. I was in love with Haiti. By the way, Haiti never returned the favor. Unbelievable unrequited love to this day. And I think now I'm a little too old for requited love with this country. So one day, after a very hard day of demonstrations and running around and being shot at in this changing world as it moved toward supposed democracy, I was out with the protesters all the time. And then me and some Haitian friends of mine, we retired to my friend Bernadette's little house in one of the, not really shantytown, but a poorer quarter. And we were all sitting around having beers. And I think maybe we were a little drunk, because usually I wasn't so naive as to say things like this, but I said, "I love your country." And I remember Beatrice turned to me and she said, "Oh, good. So you give me your passport, you stay here, and I'm going." So that they were always teaching me to understand my naivete. But so I began, and I got a book contract. And then I came down to Haiti to live, and I lived there for 2 years with a couple of mental health breaks to reassert my Americanness back home. But while I was there, a small, bespectacled Catholic Haitian priest from the shantytowns hijacked my first book on Haiti, and that was Aristide. And his story became essentially my narrative, and this was my book called The Rainy Season, Haiti Since Duvalier. I witnessed unrest, chaos, killings, assassinations, coups d'etats. Oh, here's a joke that Haitians love to tell. They like to say, here's an American. The American asks, "How come there are no coups d'etats in Washington?" And the Haitian answers, "Because there's no American embassy." So I saw a lot of coups d'etats, and believe me, there was an American embassy in Haiti. It's one of the biggest buildings there, and it did not fall down during the earthquake. Anyway, I finished my book, and the priest became president, and I was done. Finished with Haiti, on to new subjects, etc., while always keeping a little bit of a hand in, and then the earthquake came. So really, I was almost liberated from Haiti. It was like the earthquake, in my solipsistic world. It was a punishment and a reminder to me, you're still in it. So Haitians always live in stressful times. And I think that's what it means to be at the bottom of the world's economic ladder. There is no post-traumatic stress disorder in Haiti. Everyone is just suffering from traumatic stress disorder all the time. No before, no after. And the earthquake is, in a way, a kind of continuum for them. That's how they experience trauma as life, because of the scarcity that they live with all the time of every kind. Right after the quake, I watched US television news about it. I'm sure many of you did too. And I saw many things. I saw Anderson Cooper and other newbies to Haiti rushing around in their kind of hipster clothes in the rubble, saving Haitian babies, and I thought, whoa, Haiti is not for amateurs. I kept thinking this. I wrote an article with that title for The Nation. It all reminded me of an old expression that Julio was referring to, and that this book is named after, Fred Voodoo. So Fred Voodoo, naturally it's a British expression, because Americans are more politically correct than the British. So I would come back to the hotel when I was writing the rainy season, I'd be like a wreck, and I'd have been out all day, and I'd be dusty and thirsty and sunburned and excited, and I'd flop into a chair, and all the British would have been there for hours not having done anything but make calls. And they would go like, oh, so, did you talk to Fred Voodoo today? And I didn't know what they meant. But then I figured it out. He was Joe Sixpack. He was the Haitian man in the street. And I'm just going to read you a page or so. Pages are very short, about Fred Voodoo. There's a reason that awful and potent name has stuck with me, Fred Voodoo. It sums it all up in a way. First of all, how Haitians have been reduced to a very few things in the outsider's mind, and even those things not understood. When I watched television news in my kitchen in LA during the days that followed the 210 earthquake, I kept thinking of Fred Voodoo. That's how television reporters were talking as they stood in their khakis and work boots amid the rubble. That's how the camera crews were shooting. You didn't need to say Fred's name in order to summon the sentiment, which is a kind of condescension filled with pity. Look at this, the footage shouted. Yo, the morgue is just a scene of damnation, it went on. Look how bad this is over here, it said. Can you believe people are living like this? That was always an aspect of Haiti coverage, but especially after the earthquake. The objectification of the Haitians' victimization, that's one aspect of the Fred Voodoo syndrome. How beautiful the Haitians look in their misery. They always do. You can count on them. You can count on them to give the camera a huge photogenic smile upon emerging from the rubble more than a week after the earthquake. You can count on them to be bathing in a thin crystalline shower of sparkling water at sunset, half naked, with smoke from a garbage fire burning nearby, and the thin sheets of the tents they're living in transfused with the late sunlight. Gorgeous. You can count also on guns, on uniforms. You can count on a dark, angry sky over a colorful crowd as the sun goes down or comes up. In Haiti, photojournalists are active at sunrise and sunset because the light is beautiful and people's features more readable in the slanting sun. All of this makes the person known as Fred Voodoo alluring and mysterious to the outside world, strange and impenetrable and lovely as a visual object. If I've learned one thing in Haiti, it's how to deconstruct a photograph of suffering, of poverty, of the pain of others. The fact that he or she is also voluble and highly quotable and very articulate makes Fred Voodoo excellent material for video and excellent copy for the page. Indeed, for pages not unlike these pages. Anyway, for a week, I watched The Outsiders on the television. This was the post-quake army of innocent Americans and other outsiders coming to help the Haitians. The aid groupies, the crisis caravan, the disaster fans, the mobile sovereigns. All the relief and recovery people who thought they were saving or fixing Fred Voodoo, who were going to use this catastrophe in which 80% of the capital's buildings were destroyed or heavily damaged, and perhaps as many as 300,000 had died, as an opportunity to build Haiti back better, as Bill Clinton put it. He's the UN Special Envoy to Haiti. I believe he is still the UN Special Envoy to Haiti. Well, I tapped my foot impatiently. I rolled my eyes, as I so often do when watching newbies in Haiti. I shook my head at the television and at Anderson in his black outfit and his high-top desert boots. I was not a newbie. I had seen it all before, and it all came back to me as if in a vision from 20 years earlier. Oh, what? The white man was going to fix Haiti again? So I decided to do it all again myself, the things I always do in Haiti, and I was not a newbie. Now, I hate earthquakes. I mean, I wrote a book called I Feel Earthquakes More Often Than They Happen. I do, and I live in LA, so I hate them. I didn't want to see Haiti made the same as everywhere else after disaster. That's what disaster does. It equalizes, it reduces, and it flattens literally and figuratively. But I felt my obligation to Haiti, to go down, to report it all again, to see old friends who'd survived, to find out what the outsiders were really doing, what we were doing, as well as what we thought we were doing. But I swore I wouldn't write a second Haiti book. Then I wrote a second Haiti book, and that's Farewell Fred Voodoo. So Haiti's not for amateurs, as I said. You have to have Haiti eyes. There's an expression in Haiti, and it goes like this: Tout ça oué, c'est pas ça. Tout ça oué, c'est pas ça. Translated in a kind of literary way, it means nothing you see is what it seems. But more literally and more positively and all-encompassingly, it means all that you see is not that. I like that because it's very Creole. So, like, if you go to a village, you're an outsider, you come to a village, you're driving along, you decide, I just need to find a place to get some food, maybe someone will give me some food, and I can find a bed for the night. So you go into the village, and you're with a driver or a friend, and the villagers direct you to this guy in front of this building. And he's a big guy, and he's kind of like 30 years old, 37 years old, in that decade. And he's really handsome, and he's quite articulate in Creole, and he welcomes you to the village, and you think, this is the unofficial mayor of this village. But if you have Haiti eyes and you've stayed for a long time, you know that this guy is just bluff, as they say. He's bluffing. He's the front. And that the person who's really in charge of the village is the little old lady in the corner whose hat is way down, big brimmed hat, is way down on her head, and who has a giant bag of charcoal next to her. She's the boss. But you can only know that if you've been there for a long time and know where to look. So one of the rules in Haiti is don't look here, look there. There's a great story about Wycliffe Jean, who was running for president at one time in Haiti. Years before, when René Préval was president, Wycliffe came down to Haiti and he wanted to meet the president. So he got all dolled up in his best clothes, and he's a quite nice dresser and very handsome. And Wycliffe came to the presidential palace. And so he comes into the reception area with his posse, and there's some people there. And he starts talking to this little bearded guy wearing sandals. And the guy's kind of articulate, and Wycliffe's having a good enough time, but really, he came to see the president. So he goes to the guy, he says, you know what? Nice, but I want to see the president. And the guy goes, I am the president. So don't look here, look there. That story told it all to me. I knew Wycliffe would never be president of Haiti because he didn't have Haiti eyes. So there, I have better Haiti eyes than Wycliffe at all. That's pretty astounding. So I'm going to read you something about what I began to see about development in Haiti and how it was working and why it was so important to understand that tout ça ouais, c'est pas ça, and to be able to see it properly. I call this section Miracle Tree. So I had two friends who were architects in LA, and they knew I was a Haiti specialist. So after the earthquake, they were trying to get a contract to build housing for Haitians, post-disaster housing. And they called me into their very nice, swanky office in Silver Lake. And I went in and I thought, whoa, weird, I'm now going to be the Haitian, consultant on a project. That was weird. So we talked about the housing, and I gave them some pointers. They didn't get the contract, by the way. And after we finished, one of the architect's assistants got up, and he made a little presentation about a tree they think will be good for construction and other purposes in Haiti. Oh, I have seen this tree before. I have seen it so many times, I thought, as I drank an espresso prepared for me on the office machine. This tree, the young man said, grows really fast. It needs little care, little water. When it matures, in virtually no time, it can be cut down. It will spring up again, no worries. It can be used for construction. Its wood is strong, flexible in an earthquake, and heat resistant. But equally, you can make clothing out of it. And it's nutritious. You can eat its leaves. Its seed pods are natural antibiotics. If you make a tea out of its bark, it gives you more calcium than 3 glasses of milk, or some such. I drum my fingers and close my eyes, not rolling them, because I'm too close to these people. Because I have heard about these trees from development people for more than 3 decades, but I have never seen a single person in any developing country I have visited pick one of its leaves, build a house out of it, or make school uniforms from it. I'm sure they do somewhere. maybe even somewhere in Haiti. But for me, the all-purpose tree, whatever its species, embodies the impulse of so many good-hearted people from the developed world who would like very much to find a simple solution to the complicated problems of the developing world. The smartest people often begin their work in development by believing a quick fix is possible, that technology, know-how, nature, and their own good-hearted spirit will fix things. It's the Sean Penn theory of development work, and if you're Penn and working in a small enough sphere, you can get a few good things done. Why don't these trees save the world, I have often wondered. But after years of considering the question, I think I've figured out the answer, which is that we live in a world where people have been living for a long time, doing things like building civilizations, cultures, and traditions, along with simply surviving and reproducing. You can take a miracle tree into a Haitian village, and the villagers may drop a couple of leaves in their soup, but really, they don't eat leaves. They eat rice and beans and chicken when they're lucky. The only leaves they eat are thyme. They love to cook with thyme. It's the French influence. They eat cornmeal with sauce. They eat canned sardines with tomato and onions over rice. They simply don't munch on leaves. They prefer mangoes and bananas. The Vodou priest who practices traditional medicine doesn't know the leaves of the strange tree, and he too will turn away and go back to the leaves and bark he's always used for antibiotics, wounds, and medicinal drafts. Here's the thought experiment. If a bright-eyed relief worker came to you and told you that these leaves were better for your child than a glass of milk, would you substitute the leaves for milk? Would your child eat them with his Oreos? Okay, there's one woman in Mill Valley, California, who would probably try this out with her kids, but she exists. She lives in a perfect environmentally correct house, and there are probably several people in Hollywood who would try it. But other than that, no one will. Not even if your kid hasn't had a glass of milk in a week. You'd still try to figure out a way to get a glass of milk, because that's what you want for your kid, and that's what your kid wants, not leaves. What if your house fell down, and that bright-eyed relief worker told you that if you just grow these trees in your backyard, you could build your next house from them for free? Well, you just wouldn't do it. Not even if the house you lost was a shotgun shack or a trailer home. You'd still want to build back what you'd lost. People, in fact, do not easily see the value in building back better, because better is subject to interpretation. Bill Clinton's better may not be a Haitian's better. In any case, look into your own heart. Most of us want to build back the same. Or you could say, the same but better. That's how it is. You want 2 glasses of milk, maybe. 2 glasses of milk is the same but better. You want your same house, but with 1 more room. The same but better. But a bunch of leaves, while it may be better, according to the relief worker, is not better to you. It's worse. It's inedible. And you know that the relief worker himself is not eating those leaves either. So here's a good example of how Bill Clinton wanted to build Haiti back better after the earthquake. One day I was driving up the one road to the fancier part of town where I was staying with a friend, and we got in a big traffic jam. That's often the case these days, but this was especially big and long and slow. And when we finally got to the nub of the traffic jam, it was the gala opening of the Royal Oasis Hotel. People were coming out in their satins, their fancy gowns. It was a real elite Haitian event with a lot of Americans there too, because it was built in concert. So it was built with earthquake loans from the World Bank and from the Clinton-Bush Haiti Fund, which Bill Clinton started with the other former U.S. president I like to call, in a reference to Baby Doc, Baby Bush. So Baby Bush and Bill Clinton and the World Bank together pledged $9.5 million in reconstruction loans for the building of what was dubbed a luxury hotel. Where else in the world would development thinkers, if you can call them that, imagine that building a luxury hotel was a way to rebuild a poverty-stricken, earthquake-destroyed city? In fact, it was a place to stay for World Bank and Clinton-Bush Haiti Fund teams when they came down to help rebuild Haiti, and that was the excuse that was given: we need places to stay. And of course, it would employ so many Haitians. As Graham Greene wrote, "It is astounding how much money can be made out of the poorest of the poor with a little ingenuity." Anyway, so my friend and I, who had passed by the hotel the night of the gala opening, we went back a couple of nights later to see how it was running. Okay, the restaurant was completely dark except for one table filled with U.S. Embassy employees. and some elite Haitians, a gallery owner I knew, so I recognized her and could ask her about it later. And my friend and I decided we wanted to go see the presidential suite. It's always fun. I'm also a travel writer sometimes. It's fun to see the presidential suite in any hotel. So he works in Haiti. We get on the elevator, and he's a businessman. So we get on the elevator, we press 5 or 6, whatever, the top floor, and the elevator starts to go, and then it stops. And then the lights go out in the elevator. And I hear my friend, he goes like, oh no. And he goes like, okay, let's press the alarm. We press the alarm, nothing. Nothing at all. He goes, in a month, when they actually really open the hotel, they will find our 2 skeletons here. And eventually, of course, in Haiti, this always happens, as if by miracle, the thing starts to go again with no help from the outside. And we get out, and there is one of the employees of the hotel, and she starts to speak to us in Spanish. And I think, oh, these are the Haitians that are being employed at this hotel. She's a Dominican, of course. So when you gave $20 to an organization to help Haitians after the quake, I am sorry to be so cynical, okay? Where did that money go normally? It went to your organization, or if you gave to a bigger umbrella organization, it went to some organization of their choosing for Nissan Patrol 4-wheel drive 6-seater vehicles so that the outsiders can get out into the field. It went for hotel rooms like at the Royal Oasis for teams. It went for rented gated apartments for the people who came down to help. It went to restaurant meals, I know, because I used to see all these people out for dinner in at the top of the hill. It went for plane tickets for short stay employees. It went to payroll for US aid workers, and it went to consultants. About 1% of all humanitarian relief after the earthquake went to the Haitian government. There are lots of reasons for that, but it's still an embarrassing percentage. Houses made unlivable by the earthquake, there were about 246,000 of them. The houses built with all the aid since the earthquake, there are about 6,000 of them. Haitians displaced by the earthquake, about 1 million plus, and about 1 million are still living in condemned or temporary housing, and about 150,000 are still living in various dispersed tent camps. That's 5 years after the earthquake. Of U.S. foreign aid, so government foreign aid to post-quake Haiti, more than 60% went to U.S. contractors and the Defense Department. After the earthquake, contracts awarded by USAID for recovery totaled $485.5 million. Of that, 1.2% went to Haitian businesses. So you begin to see what happens is a recycling of the money. And it makes sense to the U.S. to do aid this way, because really, why would we give money to the Haitians to fix their country? We have the know-how, we have the means, we have the manpower, we can do it. Let's fund ourselves to build Haiti back better. I call this zombie aid. And thank you, Julio, for introducing the zombie earlier. I always said I've learned a lot in Haiti. Here's one thing I learned. To give is better than to receive. Okay, frankly, I always thought that this saying was utter hogwash. Ever since I was 5 years old and can remember getting a gift, my feeling was, what are they talking about? It is far better to receive than to give. That's what I always thought. Admit it. You all feel the same way. I know it. Every bone in you cries out, no, to receive is better, to receive is better. But you always pretend to give is better. But our inner selves are wrong. It is better to give than to receive. It's profound to me now. And 2 young men, really boys, both of them, when I first knew them, Philibert and McKinley, taught me this. So Philibert was an orphan who lived with Father Aristide before he was president, with a bunch of boys that Aristide took care of, protected, fed, and supposedly educated, although I don't think there was much education going on. Mostly they played cards and soccer. He was an orphan who was always going to see his mother in Cape Haitian. So orphan status is questionable in Haiti, but he was certainly an abandoned child, Philibert. The last time I saw him was about 4 years ago at a memorial for the dead of the earthquake. And I'm going to read you from my book. This is one of my lessons about to give is better than to receive. As usual, with any big Haitian event, huge numbers of people were all shoved together into a giant bubbling human mass. Although we were outside, there was barely room to inhale where we stood. But uncannily, up in front of my face, popped someone I recognized. At first, I wasn't sure who he was exactly. Then he spoke in his familiar growl of a voice, the same rasp he'd had as a child, only deeper. It was Philibert, wearing some kind of satanic red and silver T-shirt and old dirty jeans. He was too thin. I took him aside, and he began a long rant I'd already heard about his sons and their mother, and about how he had to keep them inside so she wouldn't get them, and how his motorbike had broken down, and he didn't have the money to get it fixed. Throughout the whole long saga, which was much more detailed and a lot less comprehensible than what I'm putting down here, he would look at me sideways, slantwise, assessing my potential. Half the time, he had the demeanor of a person on drugs or in the throes of mental illness of some kind, which I've always suspected with him. And the rest of the time, he looked like a smart old market lady sizing up his client. Finally, I asked him if I could help in any way, and he just looked at me. "Amy, you are my mother," he said to me in English. I was his mother. So I gave him some money. And then he disappeared into the crowd. I saw a patch of red T-shirt fading away down Grand Rue. My child, I thought. I tried to imagine it. I wondered if there really had ever been any connection between us other than monetary. Because of where I was from, I always had the power in our relationship. Because of where he was from, Philibert was always the weak one, poor, needy, desperate. Of course, we each bore some responsibility for who we were and how we had ended up, but we were also prisoners of our fates, each of us locked into our individual history and geography. I was from the United States, and he was from Haiti. That was it. I always had and gave money. He always did not have it and needed it. It was always my choice. Would I give him something? How much this time? It was easy, even pleasurable, for me to give it to him, but it was all cruel for him. The crowd around me was singing a spindly soprano hymn as the memorial service began. But where was Philibert going now in his red T-shirt? Where was he going? Why didn't he have a cell phone? Everyone else in Haiti seemed to have one. Why didn't he have my number? All my friends had it, except for him. And now that speck of red had vanished. I squinted into the sun, trying to find him again, but he had slipped back away into the heat and darkness and was lost to me. So that was Philibert. I have since seen him. He's still a druggie. It's really sad. And every time I give him money, I freak out, because, what's he going to do with it? I care too much about him to give him money, but I still give him money. So I'm going to try to speak a little bit briefly about McKinley. McKinley was a little boy who I met right after the earthquake in a town called Léogâne. Léogâne was really hard hit, like Port-au-Prince, by the earthquake. Everything had fallen down. And I went into Léogâne with a friend, and we were driving, trying to get out to Jacmel, even further out. But we saw a Doctors Without Borders clinic flag behind a wall, and so we went into the clinic. And there was this little boy on his mother's lap, and his hands had been removed in what's called a traumatic amputation. That's when an accident amputates something. His arm to here and his wrist had been removed by a wall falling on him. And he had had some surgery done already, right after the earthquake, but it wasn't very well done, and he was out of his meds. He didn't have his painkillers, but he was stoic, 3-year-old, sitting on his mom's lap in the sun. And I went and talked to the doctor, and I was blogging for Time magazine, and the Italian doctor was kind of very excited about talking to Time magazine, and I couldn't get him to focus on the little boy. So I couldn't get him to focus. We had other things to do, so we went away. We tried to go to Jacmel, but there were too many landslides. And I, as you know, do not like earthquakes, and I don't like aftershocks either, and I didn't want to be crushed by, tumbling rock. So eventually we turned around, and we're going back through Léogâne, and I turn to my friend, and he turns to me, and we both go, let's go back in. We got to go back in and see what's happening to that kid. So we go back in. The kid is on the other side of the wall, not in the bright sun anymore, so that's a slight improvement in his condition and position, but the doctor still hasn't seen him. So my friend and I look at each other again, and we say, okay, we're doing it. So we take him and his mom to a hospital in Port-au-Prince. They're quite silent the whole time. It's like they're in post-traumatic stress disorder. And we take them into town. We bring them to the hospital. I lobby really hard. He gets treated. I stick him with a friend who's a nurse at the hospital. And then I have to leave because I have to do my story. And they go back to Léogâne. I can never find them again. But I don't try very hard because I'm working. And so then I write about him. And then I feel bad about him because I'm using his story in this gross, to me, way of sentimental, poor kid, look what happens to this kid, and and who knows where he went. And then I realize I got to find him. So eventually when I go back to Haiti, I go looking for him. And I've tried to send my friends to look for him, but in post-earthquake Haiti, everyone wants money for things. In the old days, you'd say to a friend, can you go find this kid? And they'd go like, sure, I'll go look. And then they'd look and they'd find him. Of course, it's easy to find a boy with no arms, right? But at this moment, people would say to me, I need $200 to get to Leogane. You have to send me a photograph of the boy. And I would go like, you don't need a photograph. Just say boy with no hands, they'll know. But no one would do it for me without me paying the money, and I didn't trust them enough if they asked for money for this to give them money. So when I went down, I went precisely, as the French would say, précisément, to Leogane. I went to the center of town. I said to an old lady, do you know where the boy with no hands lives? She goes, yeah, right up there, like that, immediately. Everyone knew him in the whole town because he had no hands. So we found him, we got him, and I eventually arranged for him to have prostheses, and they're a little big and a little heavy, because he's little. Now he's 6. So he's a little guy, and his arms are too big, but he can use them sort of, and the doctors I've finagled with to get him free arms, think about that, have shown me videos of him using them. But, you know, I just don't trust it. He lives up in a shack on the top of a mountain where his family has lived since the revolution, and he's a child with a lot of sisters and cousins, and they're all feeding him. What's he going to use those arms for? You know, to cut cane? I don't think so. So I think the arms will lie on a table for a long time, and people will point to them. And eventually, I don't know what they'll do with. They'll find something to do with them. But so it makes me worry about the limits of charity and that exchange. What is that exchange worth? And I feel like a Victorian lady, you know, going through the mud to one of the workers' houses on her property who has cholera, bringing some bread in a basket for them. The little mud on my hem, you know. So here's another paradigmatic story about charity. It's not about Haiti, but it might as well be. I have a friend named John, and John, he has a helicopter rental business. He rents helicopters to the movie industry and to hobbyists and all sorts of people. And there's a homeless man at the entrance to the 10 freeway. If anyone's from LA, they would know exactly who I'm talking about. He's kind of an outsider artist, and he builds these huge things out of garbage, and he always includes rocking horses. So they're big, like giant rocking horses made out of fenders and stuff he collects. And so I call him Rocking Horse Man. So John was feeling extra generous one day. He's seen Rocking Horse Man every day of his life as he goes to his office on the 10. And he thought, I'll give Rocking Horse Man $50. I'll make his day. So John is kind of excited, and he's feeling what we call charity anxiety in Haiti, like, I'll give him 50, will it be weird, what's going to happen? So Rocking Horse Man takes it from John, who's extended it at the passenger window, and Rocking Horse Man takes it, and he puts it in his pocket. No response whatsoever. John is very disappointed. So let's parse the exchange, right? John wanted the satisfaction of giving. But Rocking Horse Man refused to give him that. He didn't want to go, thank you, massa, thank you. No way. He ascribes to what Papa Doc Duvalier used to say, gratitude is cowardice. I love that quote. But maybe, this is what I thought, maybe Rocking Horse Man didn't even see what the bill was. John speculated that that was a possibility. He never wants to give to Rocking Horse Man again. He's now experiencing what we call in Haiti sympathy fatigue. He doesn't feel sorry for Rocking Horse Man anymore because Rocking Horse Man wasn't grateful. But what I really think happened was that Rocking Horse Man is a very astute guy. Oh yeah, he's used to receiving. He lives off what we call in Haiti the compassion economy. He saw right away it was a $50 bill. He could practically feel Ulysses S. Grant's beard on that bill without even looking at it. But he thought maybe John had made a mistake. He wasn't going to point it out, right? Oh, you gave me a $50 bill, sir. Oh, I didn't mean to. Could you give that back, please? So he pockets it, saying nothing. Misunderstanding on everyone's part, and the giver feels unacknowledged, the receiver not even sure what the giver meant to give. That's charity. Here's what our great imperialist president, Teddy Roosevelt, said. Sentimental humanitarians always form a most pernicious body, with an influence for bad hardly surpassed by that of the professional criminal class. Okay, he was an exaggerator like Mark Twain, but it's kind of a good quote. Okay, but this painful exchange of moral specie that takes place in the giving and receiving of charity calls into question the whole construct, the whole transaction of charity. It's a revealing transaction. Take the expression give back, one of my least favorite expressions. Everyone who went to Haiti after the earthquake wanted to give back. But they'd never been to Haiti before. So what were they giving back? I felt like I'm giving back, because I took, but what are they giving back? It's an unspoken acknowledgement, though, that actually we have taken something. And there's the sub rosa feeling that we've taken a lot, and we'll come back and give a little. For me, logically, what follows is this. Can there be, actually, an us without them? That is to say, without what is called in aid studies the bottom billion. Can there be our condition of grotesque material surplus without theirs, of scarcity, dearth, hunger, and disease? And aren't the moral costs of this rather high? As Frederick Douglass said, no man puts a chain about the ankle of his fellow man without at last finding the other end fastened about his own neck. After watching Haiti and thinking and writing about it for as long as I have, I wonder, is there a way to repair the damage done by the system without changing the system? Isn't giving back, as it has been performed in post-quake Haiti by people like Oprah and Kim Kardashian and Patricia Arquette and Olivia Wilde and Charlie Sheen and Sean Penn, to say nothing of hundreds of young missionaries and many college students on spring break and scores of young Clinton interns? Isn't it something we can call conscience laundering? As Peter Buffett has said, giving back just keeps the existing structure of inequality in place. The rich sleep better at night, while others just get enough to keep the pot from boiling over. This used to be called the Band-Aid approach: patch over the symptoms and leave the disease in place, never deal with the underlying causes. Einstein wrote somewhere that you can't solve a problem using the same tools that created it, the same approach. So there's this thing called the American Plan for Haiti. It was in place in the 1980s under that name, before Duvalier was ousted. It's still in place. Here's a sample of the ongoing American plan. This is from USAID's Haiti page. USAID has worked in Haiti for approximately 50 years, helping to mitigate the impact of natural disasters and periods of political instability, while increasing long-term economic growth and security. USAID assistance has focused on supporting sustained economic growth by attracting private investment and increasing agricultural output, expanding access to healthcare and education, supporting the transition to democracy, and protecting human rights. That sounds good, right? But I have to say, what sounds good in there is basically outright lies. And the real nub is this, quote, attracting private investment, unquote. That's the Royal Oasis Hotel. And that's Caracol, the new industrial park in the north, whose anchor is a South Korean-owned and run garment factory, also built with earthquake funding, although it is far, far, far from the site of the earthquake's damage. I wrote a blog about the Caracol garment factory, and I complained about it, saying, is this really like the great solution to Haiti's woes, more garment factories? And USAID, who had helped get the deal done, and the garment factory owners, the South Korean, it's a huge conglomerate, got freaked out by my blog. Like, first time I get any response, I was kind of pleased. And they invited me to come look at the place. Come on and see it, and then you'll see it's not so bad. So it's, okay, it's not so bad. It's not like the place in Bangladesh that fell down. It's not some old, rickety, horrible building. It's a long, low building. It looks like this, but bigger. But I did talk to USAID about the idea of garment industry, and they were very honest with me. They said to me, you simply cannot build an economy on the garment industry. It will not lift the next generation out of poverty. To do that, you have to have infrastructure, a textile industry, which is different, who knew, and an economic plan. You have to have a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan, and a 15-year plan, none of which Haiti's government has managed to get its act together to do. So the women at the factory, and it's almost all women, make about $4.75 a day. It should be $5, but somehow they get cheated out of a little of it. And they're making T-shirts that we buy for $5.75. So they don't make them very well, as many of these factories don't make them very well, but we buy them because they're cheap. So we buy them, we wear them for 5 to 8 months, then we're sick of them, they fall apart, and we give them to Goodwill. And then Goodwill puts them in bales and crates them back to Haiti and spreads them out in the market, and Haitians buy the things that they made for 50 cents. And the tailor, the Haitian tailor down the street, would have made that T-shirt to last for 2 years for $1, but he's out of work. And because you're poor, you can't plan for the future. You buy the 50-cent shirt even though you know it's trash and it's going to fall apart because it's cheap. So that's the kind of irony that happens. Obviously, I've way simplified the passages of goods. But what happens really is that workers in garment factories, like these Haitian women, are paid. By the way, they are the descendants of the people who built the citadel and the descendants of the people who won freedom for the Haitian slaves. Just want to clarify. So these women make just enough, in other words, for them to reproduce and make children for the next generation's workforce to live in poverty with their very own starvation wages, making our children's T-shirts and having more children to work in the next generation of factories. In other words, what foreign aid seems to be supporting is a perpetual poverty machine. So let me finish by talking about zombies, which Julia so kindly introduced. The idea of the living dead came from Africa, but it got a special twist in the slave work camps of the New World. And the zombie is a slave forever. He cannot even die to get away from his eternal servitude. And I'm going to read you on a page in here. Let me see if I can find it. Okay. Don't panic, it's short. Now, here in LA, I feel that zombies are all around me. They're in the movies, on television, on billboards, skull-like and dripping excreta and something that looks like moss. Often they're portrayed as, somehow, phosphorescent. They come to my door at Halloween. They're trendy. There is something about a zombie, I realize, that speaks to us at the beginning of the 21st century. They are inherently dank, a word that now, in the age of zombies, means cool or good. The zombie is something we all fear becoming, if we think about it. He's frightening in a primordial way and in a modern way, too. He's dead, but he's walking. He has to work even after death. He's the living dead, an ancient figure, but he's also the inanimate, animated, like the robot of industrial dystopias. The god of the dead in Vodou does not take the zombie across to the other side, to the rest that death promises. The other side, among slaves in the New World colonies, was Africa, idealized from memory as the land of freedom. In Haiti still, when a person dies, it is understood that he or she returns to Languinée, or Africa, and freedom. Roughly translated, Languinée means heaven. The rest of the world to Haitians is known as L'autre bout de l'eau, or the other side of the water. For the zombie, this final rest in Languinée, or paradise, is unavailable. With his perfect obedience and lack of any future, the zombie, who cannot escape from servitude even in death, is the echt citizen in a dictatorship. He's great for fascism. One recent zombie movie was called The Fourth Reich. The zombie is willing. He works for free. You feed him very little. He makes no demands, as Julio pointed out. He's like Apple's Chinese factory workers, or like the refugees in Haiti's earthquake camps, or like guest workers in European countries, or like employees at call centers in India or the Philippines, except he's not desperate. He simply is. As such, he's devoid of hope and consciousness, and therefore unable to come up with a critique of the system he's trapped in, or a plan to rise up from his servitude. There are too many plausible zombies in the world today, and that's why this old African-American figure from slave days has penetrated the global consciousness. We don't want to be turned into that. In Haiti, the zombie is the very purest form of the slave, deadened, soulless, egoless, empty-eyed. Becoming a zombie would make a mockery of a slave's one certain free action: suicide. So, in Haiti, the old Catholic literacy primers in the 1980s were called goût de sel, or a taste of salt, because a taste of salt for the zombie, and everybody in Haiti knows this, salt, you can't give a zombie salt, because once he has salt, once he has good food, in other words, tasty food, he begins to come to consciousness. So he has to eat all boring, bad food. So it was called goût de sel because that was thought that that's what literacy was, okay? The idea of the liberation theologists was that reading and the ensuing political engagement that might come of reading and knowledge was the only thing that would change the Haitian situation. It's called conscientisation in French, or consciousness raising. In the case of the zombies, this is literal. You take the dead, you give them salt or literacy, and you raise the dead into consciousness, awareness, and political action. And this, not charity, is the only way to help them escape from the perpetual poverty machine. Thank you. I'd love to take some questions from Springfield or from here.
Those are their mic's position, so if anybody has a question,
Don't be shy, this is my favorite part. If you will do it, I would be so honored.
make your way to the mic and introduce yourself. Or if the Springfield, I don't know if it's,
Here come, you have to make your way to the mic. You gotta make,
so you want to just introduce yourself? Go ahead.
yeah, introduce yourself. Hi. Is it on?
I'll just use my voice. My name is Danielle LaRoque, and I'm a senior here at UMass. And a lot of what you said reminded me of my trip to Cape Verde
Yeah.
this past week. As many of you may know or not know, there was a volcanic eruption that happened in November 2014, and 4 months later, they're still waiting for their relief funds and all the other donations that they've been getting from around the world, and they have yet to see it. So I was just thinking about what you were, like, basically your experience in Haiti, and thinking as a person from a privileged standpoint, being from America, how can you use your privilege and use it at your advantage to help without feeling bad? Because at the same time, when you're looking at them, you feel bad that you're helping them because you have this thing in mind of having that savior complex, which you don't want. And
Okay, so the question is, how can you, a person from a place of privilege, help people who are in trouble in a place that is poor, right? I don't know, I mean, that's the question my whole book is about. And is it possible, and is it possible to do with respect and properly? I mean, I think it is. I think participating in literacy programs, that's a great thing. Participating in programs and thinking in new ways about structures that can be put in place that eventually will question the way things are run, both in your country and in the country in need. See, in Haiti, it's a particularly immediate problem because we have such a long relationship with Haiti, and we've been so immixed in Haiti's politics and in its problems that really we're quite guilty of causing many of the problems there, so we have an obligation. Now, Cap Verde, how do you say the name of it?
I'm not.
Yeah, but how do you say it?
I say Cape Verde, but they say Cabo Verde.
Cabo Verde. So in this place, I don't think that we have much of a relationship with it. So it's really a question of, you know, do you feel it's your Christian duty to help them, and then how do you do it? Do they want it? In what way do they want it? I always talk about the difference between relief and recovery. So relief is really a necessary thing. The day after the volcanic eruption, that's when they need you to be there, and that's a good time to be there. And that is a time when you don't have to feel bad about anything. You pick up, like Anderson Cooper, you pick up the baby and you run for the hills and get him away from whatever bad thing is happening and find his mom and dad. That, nobody's going to say, you're a bad person because you did that. But it's when you begin to be a part of the system that's corrupt and in place already, and that has caused maybe a third of the deaths for various reasons, that it begins to be complicated. So that's recovery, when you're starting to rebuild and you're not thinking very clearly about what is your role and what you're doing. That's when it gets complicated. But relief is always necessary, appreciated, and the proper Judeo-Christian Islamic thing to do.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Now I know there were other questions there, because I saw people begin to bob.
I had a question.
Yes, well.
Because I was interested in what you said at the end of your lecture about promoting literacy in Haiti and other places where there is this similar type of problem. And I'm very interested in that, and I too speak French. But I was discussing this with some of my colleagues, and how do you promote literacy in Haiti? I did some search, I've never been there, I did some research online. They speak Creole, generally, the textbooks are in French. What do you do? What do you propose? The schools are falling apart, apparently, teachers are not educated, there is no teachers. What can we do from here to help, aside from sending books in French, in Creole? Are there any books in Creole? I'm sure there are, but...
Okay. The question is, how can you promote literacy in a country where there's an elite language, a colonial language like French, in which all business and government is transacted, and a spoken language in which there are very few books written. What constitutes literacy in such a place? So a lot of the discussion centers around grade school teaching in Creole. Everyone should learn in Creole. No one should learn in French in Haiti until they're taking it as a second language. That's one thought.
Is Creole the official language of the government over there?
Well, it wasn't for years. It was kind of suppressed, but not. And French was the official language of Haiti. Now, in 1987, in the new constitution, it's Creole and French. So they're both official. But people still judge you. In terms of class, if you can't speak French. I had a friend who brought in a kid she had raised, even though he wasn't her own, from the slums, and she brought him in to show me how well he spoke French. And I'm like, again, the drumming fingers, the rolling eyes, because what does that tell me, and how well does he write, and why French, and why does she think French is so important? But yet, of course, French is important. Because French, you want Haiti to be able to have a relationship with the rest of the world in terms of its literacy as well as within the country. But I think the most important thing is for kids to be able to read words. Once you can read words, read letters, then you can begin to learn another language, read in that language, and you're set. You know, I know that I'm literate in French and English. I know a Haitian kid can be literate in Creole and French. And Creole is now a written language. So, and there are books in Creole, and some of the best writers in Haiti and people I really, really respect write their books in Creole and then translate them into French. And this is a movement in Africa also to write in the indigenous language and then have it translated into the colonial language. So I think that's really important too. But it's a very hard question. And then there's also a competition in Haiti between English and French. And there's the problem that the schools are so bad that we're really talking in the air. That we're not even talking about a real thing. Because I watch kids in schools in Haiti, their parents are paying like, you know, a quarter of their tiny, tiny income to send their kids to schools. It's not free. And they send their kids to schools, and then you go look in on the school, and the teacher doesn't know how to speak French. And they're teaching these little teeny starving children who haven't had breakfast how to read French. And they're not paying any attention. They're sleeping.
So are missionaries, in that case, the way to go in terms of educating children?
No, it has to be the Haitian government. It has to take a step toward public education. There has to be a huge rethinking of how the Haitian government is run. It has to happen.
And until this happens, if it ever happens.
Yeah, it's another 2 generations, maybe
Okay,
not.
thank you.
Sorry. I wish I could be more sanguine. You have to go up to the microphone according to my handlers. But I want your question.
And just a comment again on literacy. Well, you know, I don't want to sound cynical.
Oh, that's all right. You've
And
come
I'm
to the
not.
right place.
But no, well, but the problem really is, or one problem is that we don't know exactly how to spread literacy here.
Right.
And do you know how much money UMass spends on remedial education? Kind of doubling the money that was supposed to pay for literacy in middle school, high school, and so on.
So this is a comment, I'm speaking for the Springfield people, on how hard it is to spread literacy here in the United States, where we theoretically have one language, and how much it costs, and how difficult it's been for so long. So that's an interesting point. Here we are trying to spread literacy in Haiti, but we don't even have full literacy in the US. But in Haiti, it's supposedly the literacy rate is around 30%. When I had to guess it, I guessed 20%, because anecdotally for me, that's what I see. So it's a problem. I think one thing about literacy is that a certain kind of literacy is promoted by the cell phone and by texting. But it's a very limited literacy, but at least it's an alphabet recognition. Up to the microphone, my friend.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation.
You're welcome.
I thought about 2 things while you were speaking, and my question is enfolded in those 2 things. First, the question of literacy and the sort of culture of the United States. trying to disseminate literacy elsewhere. When you described the problems of making a school work, or making, when you describe the problem of foreign aid, particularly foreign aid that passes through the membrane of USAID, it sounds very much like the problem of the federal government giving money to the public schools in Holyoke or Philadelphia. You know, is that the administrators absorb at least 60 to 80%
Right.
of the quote-unquote aid. The other thing is that in light of that, it seems that what we could do best here is not to do, what was the phrase that Clinton used?
Build back better?
We can build back better, so to speak, by making use of the wealth that we have in our national archives, particularly the military intelligence files that go back to the occupation of Haiti in 1913, 1914, to demonstrate to your average American how the imperial supply chain, how Haiti is connected to the United States through an imperial supply chain, and how that has been perpetuated over time, sans Marines.
Right.
So if we could, you know, if we could help the people of Haiti, what we could do is make sure that they have access to the information we generate, and they'll take care of their own if they have enough caloric intake. They'll take care of their own problems, you know, by making a government that breaks that imperial supply chain once and for all.
It's hard for me to resume this short peroration for the people in Springfield, but I think it's a mistake to assume that Haitians don't at least understand without the actual documentation that you suggest it would be good to have out there, and I totally agree with you. But the government in Haiti and the political class in Haiti fully understands the relationship to the imperium of the United States. The problem is they like the relationship.
Oh yeah,
And that is that's the big problem, as I'm sure you're aware. And so that they don't, even though they know what's happening, they are that screen where the money disappears, where part of the money disappears. And that's a problem. But I believe that the Haitian government, like other governments in similarly situated countries, has been essentially created to be a corruption dissemination machine. And it was really perfected under the U.S. occupation. And so that's what they think of the government as being. It's like the one place where you can make money in the country, the one place reliably there's money to be had. And there's not the sense of the government, the state working for the nation. And that's a gigantic problem in Haiti. And I really think, I totally agree with you, until the Haitians assume the role of leading the nation and helping the people, we can talk all we want about literacy. I certainly don't see the United States as spreading literacy in Haiti. The little Catholic Church, the Baz, as they were called, I could see them doing it somewhat, but even the Catholic Church is such a torrid history in Haiti that it's hard to imagine they could successfully do it. No, the Haitians have to do it themselves. I'm waiting for a government that isn't selected by the United States to come to power, that isn't then plucked out of power by the United States. So, yeah. Others? Please. You have to go up to the microphone, you, in the hat.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm an alum of the History Department, class of 2010.
Yay.
So I'm really happy to be there. I also run a small nonprofit organization that works in Leogon. And when I was a student here at UMass, right after the earthquake, I went to work with the disaster response organization that shall remain nameless that was working in Leogane and had a very strong presence there. When I was in college, I ran a construction company and I had a lot of background in concrete and cement. And I was brought there to teach the Haitians how to do cement. 90% of the buildings fell in Leogane, and the numbers are 30,000 people died. My wife is a survivor of the earthquake in Leogane, and she told me that the smell of bodies was so bad for months that they prayed for wind from the mountains so they would get a breath of fresh air. But, so I went there, I was taken there as someone who knew concrete to teach them. And as I remember my first time sitting around with my translator and telling people how to put cement together, there are certain ratios of sand,
Right.
gravel, and so forth. I realized that every single person who was standing there knew the ratios, they knew how to put cement together, and in fact a lot of them have been doing it more than me. What was explained to me when I bothered to ask, and the key was bothering to ask, is that the cement was expensive, and they wouldn't put the cement in.
That's the problem.
And I've been to Haiti this will be my 14th time in May, and I can tell you the buildings are being rebuilt, and being rebuilt just as bad because people still can't supply the cement at appropriate ratios because it's still just as expensive, and the poverty is even worse now. My organization, Your Story International, we try to start partnerships with local people and families. Our focus now is Leogane. And I can tell you that MSF Hospital is still just as bad as when you saw it last.
Their notes to me arrive every week. Will you please give money to Médecins Sans Frontières? Every week I get them. Every week I throw them in the garbage.
Well, you got to get there at 2 in the morning to get in, and you might get some nutritional supplements if you go there early enough. The solutions are there on the ground. People have ideas. No one bothers to ask. When we give anti-poverty grants, we talk to families and we partnership with them to see what do they want to do.
Well, that is a big deal, right? What do you want to do?
And oftentimes their ideas are way better than us. In fact, we're working with a small organization now called, their name is Parlez moins, travail plus, talk less, work more. For 100 goods, we'll go, and this is a local company we're giving startup funds to, for 100 goods, we'll go to someone's house and give them plants that they could then sell for 1,500 goods. And they have ideas, people have ideas, but the problem is that those ideas and those solutions totally undermine our understanding of the global status, the global economic status quo. They question it and they challenge it, and that's scary for us. My question is, tourism is starting to pop up again.
Yeah.
What do you think about how it's coming up, how it's popping up, and where it's going?
So after a bit of a disquisition, a very elegant one, on how aid can possibly work in Haiti by actually asking Haitians what they want and need and what their ideas are, which is not done that often. Actually, aid groups often meet in tiny little cells. What do they call them? I'm forgetting the aid name for these groups of aid workers who meet together to decide what they're going to do in Haiti. It's a very weird concept. But so the question is, tell me the question again? Tourism. Oh, tourism is rearing its ugly head. So I have about 3 friends in the tourism industry in Haiti. They're all very excited. Yeah, because they're going to make money off it. And as a travel writer, I worry about tourism a lot because I've seen a lot of the falsehoods, to use a nice word for it, that goes with tourism where, it's ecotourism, you employ so many people. But really, you employ people because it's a business that employs people. So let's not talk about how great tourism is or how humanitarian tourism is. It's tourism. So can it be good for a country? That's what you have to look at. Can it be good for Haiti to have tourism? I think it can be if Haiti controls the tourism and if Haitians, ensure that it's not done in a disgusting, exploitive manner. But personally, I think it's good because I want more people to understand Haiti. I want them to at least see the citadel, and I want them to think all the falsehoods about the citadel. I want them to think it's like the Statue of Liberty, which also has falsehoods, by the way. But I want them to see this incredible thing built by former slaves. I want that seen. I want everybody to know about it, not just probably most of the people in this room knew about it already. I want people to see how beautiful Haiti is. And, a friend of mine who is very conscientisée, she really understands Haiti. She's an American married to a Haitian. So she took her family from the US on a trip to Haiti. And it was Christmas time, and she just did it straightforward, I'm taking you to Haiti, tourist. And then she posted her pictures on her Facebook page, and I'm looking at them and I'm thinking, Sabina, this is what you show your family? I mean, she's lived in the shanty towns. She knows so much about Haiti. And she probably took them in there. But most of the pictures were, white, gorgeous beaches, hammocks between palms, the hotel rooms. And I thought, wow, that's Haiti, in a way I've never seen it. And I thought, okay, normalize. I like that idea a little bit. I just want them to have more money in Haiti. And I want them, instead of, when a hotel gets built, instead of 2 contractors and 2 government ministers skimming, I want the money to go into the Haitian coffers for education. So the more progress and money that can come in and get into the national coffers, the better in theory. But there has to be a responsible government, and that is a gigantic problem. And, as long as the U.S. wants a rubber stamp government for whatever projects it wants to do and its friends want to do in Haiti, it's going to be a problem to have a responsible, upright government in Haiti. We've seen it. I mean, you can't even question it. Someone told me, a former ambassador recently said, oh, the Haitian people love Mickey Martelly. They're really glad he's in power. They all voted for him. It's just a lie. So, I don't know. It's hard. More questions? Springfield questions? No one? The Springfield audience is silent. Yes? Here's another question. Oh, I like your T-shirt.
You mentioned how, you had, garment workers, and they would make T-shirts and stuff, but these were, poorly paid. That reminded me of, the 1900s, cities in America. Do you think creating stronger unions in Haiti would help increase, immediate wealth to most of the people? Force them to work together?
The question is, creating stronger unions in Haiti, would that give more wealth to the Haitian people? No. It's organized, and this is not just true in Haiti. The stronger your union, the less likely the outsider is to come in and put his plant there. So if there's no garment plant built with outsider money, and you're talking about a country that's impoverished and it doesn't build its own garment factories, you're just not going to have a garment factory. And that's always been the argument that the U.S. government uses to quash union movements in places like Haiti. So when I went to the Caracol factory, I said, well, do you have a union here? Oh, yes. They said, here's our union rep. This is the head of the company that runs the garment factory. He's standing here. He says, union rep, come over. Union rep comes over. I say, how's the union? Oh, great. Are you free to, organize? Oh, yes. The guy's watching the whole transaction. I was not allowed to interview her separately. So, yeah, the unions, they have a union, but they're not free. And the labor movement is effectively dead. Sorry to report. Maybe it will rise up again if we get tourism. Or not. Hi.
Hi, thanks for your talk, which I really enjoyed, and I'm going to take a different tack. I'm interested to know, so how do your Haitian friends or the people who you meet in Haiti respond to what you write about them?
The last email I got from someone I wrote about in this book, I can't say over the airwaves because it had a big expletive in it that wasn't friendly toward me. So often so this is a writer's question a little bit, a reporter's question, a writer's question. Often I write sort of unthinkingly because I'm a very fiction-y writer, and my impulse is, oh, that's a good story, I'm going to put it in. And then to figure out how to put the story in. And then I put it in thinking, oh, that's fun, and he's really like that, and he'll really like seeing himself as he really is. No, he didn't like it so much. And I didn't think about, is it good for him on his resume when he needs to keep getting work in Haiti to be seen saying this, or I just didn't, I'm not quite careful enough. But then there's also the question of, Aristide, So I wrote a book. My first book is quite friendly to his candidacy, not to his candidacy, to his existence, to his statements, to his analysis of Haiti, but then he became president. So I always say I'd rather have a friend in prison than in the presidential palace, because it's much simpler. If they're in prison, you can still go on respecting them and loving them and not questioning them. But once they're in the presidential palace, all bets are off. But he didn't know that, because he's used to the Haitian milieu, where if you're an Aristide supporter, you're an Aristide supporter forever. And I kind of am somewhat of an Aristide supporter forever. Don't tell anyone in Haiti. But we don't speak to each other anymore. I'm an Aristide supporter because I think he was effectively a symbol for the Haitian people's freedom. Not because he himself really was that, but he became that figure. And so I still support him, but things I've written about him, he just can't stand. And I understand that, but we don't speak. He's no longer a source of mine. You're welcome. Anyone else? Okay, then thank you so much for coming. Thanks for your questions.